Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the Oval Office, where presidents did not rely on social media teams or modern polling, but on the full weight of a nation's expectations. Forget the glamorous state dinners and smiling photo ops. The real story is about brutal scandals, endless crises, and the gamble of every decision on public approval. So tonight we ask what it really took to survive as an American president. What did it feel like to wake each morning under the glare of history, knowing a single misstep could redefine your legacy? Every presidency had its own nightmare, so let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see who's joining this journey through the corridors of power. Now dim the lights, pull your blanket close, and let's step into the Lincoln bedroom together. You step onto the wide marble steps before the Capitol, heart pounding so fiercely that each beat echoes in your ears. A layer of bulletproof glass stands between you and the mass of faces gathered below. The sun glints off its surface, casting a harsh glare over the crowd. You stand behind the glass, dressed in a crisp suit, your tie carefully knotted, your eyes scanning the faces that crowd the plaza. Camera flashes ignite like distant fireworks, followed by the constant hum of whispered chatter. Every face in that crowd carries a story. Some look hopeful, some wary, and some glow with a fervor that hints at loyalty or resentment in equal measure. Your breath catches as you recall the stakes of this moment. One misstep, one ill-chosen word, and the fragile calm can shatter. Beneath the weight of thousands of eyes, you lift your chin and step forward, toes brushing the threshold where steel and glass meet marble and sky. The glass stands 5 feet tall and spans the length of the platform. At no point do you step beyond its protection. You recall the warnings from security briefings. Never turn your back. Always keep your eyes on the crowd. Words carry far beyond this stage. A ring of Secret Service agents stands close behind you, jaws set and eyes vigilant. Their gloved hands hover near concealed earpieces. At a moment's notice, they could whisk you away from this glass enclosure, but for now, you remain pinned in place, visible yet unreachable. You adjust the microphone on the dark podium before you. Through the thick glass, you can see a sea of flags waving, each carried by a well-meaning supporter. You hear a murmur rising and falling like a tide. The press is rolling cameras, and the crowd grows restless. You steady your hands on the podium, gripping its edges to anchor yourself against the tide of expectation. The glass muffles the sounds, but does not mute their intent. You sense tension in the air. Some hold signs that proclaim hope, others hold placards that threaten protest. The reality is clear. Behind every sign may stand a face that either welcomes your leadership or despises your very existence. Your mind sifts through the words you practiced, the opening lines of a speech meant to unite a divided nation. My fellow citizens, you rehearsed, but now you wonder if those words still hold meaning. You glance at a clip of notes on the podium, hoping you won't forget the carefully chosen phrases meant to calm hearts. Next to your notes stands a single glass of water. You reach for it, gulping before setting it back down. You swallow again, feeling the dryness in your throat. The glass wicks away any direct threat, but it also stands as a barrier, a reminder that distance separates you from those you wish to lead. Behind the bulletproof glass, murmurs ripple across the crowd. You watch as a woman near the front raises her fist in a gesture of defiance. A man beside her looks away, arms crossed over his chest. A child perched on a parent's shoulders waves a small flag. You pause your gaze there, finding a spark of innocence amid the turmoil. You remind yourself that beneath the layers of protest and expectation, there are daughters and sons who deserve a future unmarred by conflict. You draw in a breath, letting the air fill your lungs. The wind stirs, making the flags snap like discontented dogs. You sense the pressure rising like a physical force. You look down at the prepared text, then back at the faces behind the glass. Each word must be weighed with precision. The margin for error is razor thin. You speak aloud beneath your breath, strength in unity, courage in truth. You close your eyes for a fraction of a second, gathering resolve. When you open your eyes again, the hush intensifies. Cameras click and whir. The crowd leans forward, eager for any sign of hesitation or confidence. You clear your throat and adjust the microphone's angle. Your voice emerges, measured and calm. My fellow Americans, today marks the beginning of a new chapter. The echo of your words reverberates inside the glass chamber. You watch the crowd's reaction. Some faces nod, others tilt in suspicion. You feel every syllable register like a ripple across water. You continue. I stand before you humbled by the trust you have placed in me. Each phrase carries weight. You pause and allow the words to settle. The glass shimmers as your reflection overlaps with the people before you. In that moment, you see yourself not as an individual, but as a symbol of the entire democratic experiment. You sense the gravity beneath your words. Our nation faces many challenges, you add, voice steady, and they will not be solved by one person alone. You look down to your notes. It is through our unity, our shared values, and our unwavering commitment to democracy that we shall prevail. The phrase, shared values, hangs in the air as though alive. You see a ripple of hope cross some faces, but others lower their eyes in doubt. You steel yourself and press on. I promise to lead with honesty, to listen with compassion, and to act with courage. The glass before you reflects your determined expression. The reflection is a reminder that you are both separate from and part of this vast assembly. Directly behind you, an agent taps your shoulder softly. You glance at their watch. Your time is nearly up, and the ceremony must move on. You realize that every second on this stage carries unspoken risks. One misstep in tone could turn hope into dissent, and one omission could fuel outrage. You take another breath and finish your formal remarks. May we find strength in our diversity and hope in our shared future. God bless you, and God bless these United States of America. As you remove your hands from the podium, a wave of applause and cheers rises from the crowd. The sound shudders against the glass, as though slammed by a gust of wind. Still, it remains distant, muffled. You offer a brief, tight-lipped smile, nodding your head in acknowledgement. You know that applause now does not guarantee unity tomorrow, yet it offers a moment of reprieve from anxiety. You step back slightly, watching the crowd lean away from the podium. Camera flashes burst. You sense the sea of faces hold thousands of stories in anticipation. Your heart beats hard, but you stand firm. Behind the glass, you are protected physically, yet every word you spoke carries risks that no barrier can fully contain. You reflect on the young faces that cheered and the old faces that wept, each hoping you would lead with wisdom and strength. As your time on the stage ends, you retreat behind the glass's protective shield. The ceremony continues as the next speaker emerges. You take a final measured breath and whisper under your breath. Each word must count. You recall the weight of every vow, every promise made this morning. Though the day ahead will bring crises, scandals, and tests of loyalty, you know that today's moment set the tone. You touch the cool glass and feel its solidity, a reminder of the thin margin that separates vision from reality. As you step away from the podium, you pass through a double set of doors behind the glass. Secret Service agents flank you, guiding you towards safety. The hush of the crowd lingers in your mind, each face imprinted on your memory. You will carry these moments, every fervent cheer, every anxious frown, into the decisions you make in these coming days. For now, you exit the candlelit alcove of glass and steel into a corridor where aides await, prepared to shepherd you toward the tasks that lie ahead. Inwardly, you vow to remember the hush that followed your final words. You remind yourself that power lies not in the glass that protects you, but in the courage to speak truth and pursue unity. Each breath that filled your lungs at that moment underscored the fragile trust placed in you. As the crowd's cheers fade behind the transparent shield, your resolve hardens. You step forward from behind the glass into the heavy responsibility that awaits, knowing the anxieties of this inauguration will guide you as you learn to navigate the uncharted waters of leadership. Overflowing with both fear and determination, you lock eyes with the aides who carry your steady gaze outward. You understand that every promise you made this morning remains only as strong as the work you will do. Yet for now, you take solace in the fact that you stood before a nation, protected by glass, and spoke the words meant to bind a divided people. The future stretches ahead, uncertain and wide. But in this moment of inauguration anxiety, you find the first spark of hope that will guide you through the trials yet to come. You step away from the podium and move through a long hallway of white marble columns. Secret Service agents flank you on both sides. Their eyes remain alert, scanning each doorway and alcove as though expecting a sudden threat. Behind you, the roar of the crowd fades into distant echoes. You pass beneath a massive chandelier that hangs from a rounded ceiling painted with scenes of history. Its light seems to warm the cool air in the corridor. You recall being a child and standing beneath a similar ceiling in a historic courthouse. At that moment, you dreamed of service and leadership. Now you walk beneath this same kind of light, burdened by the reality of guiding a nation. The hallway curves toward the rear of the building, and you follow aides who hold folders full of urgent papers. One holds an envelope marked Urgent Foreign Crisis and steps forward with a steady hand. You take it and glance at the official seal embossed in gold. A knot tightens in your stomach. You know that each line inside calls for decisions that could affect thousands of lives. In that moment, you understand the difference between pageantry and power. Pageantry ends here, behind these doors. Power begins with these folds of paper. You pass portraits of past leaders on your right. Each face watches you from gilded frames. You see Lincoln as he stands tall with weary eyes. You see Washington in his uniform, chin lifted in determination. Jackson stares back with a stern gaze. You feel their silent questions. Will you serve as they did, in courage and integrity? You step forward and imagine their world, a time before instant communication, when decisions carried similar weight but fewer voices contested each choice. You enter a small anteroom where your family waits. Your spouse stands with a gentle smile as your child clings to a stuffed animal. The child's eyes glimmer with innocence and exhilaration. You crouch to meet their gaze and brush a strand of hair from their forehead. They ask if you will be safe. You laugh softly, acknowledging both innocence and worry. You promise to return at day's end and try to keep the promise even though you know the day's challenges may stretch into long hours. Your spouse offers a cool glass of water. You swallow gratefully, feeling it soothe a dry throat unused to public strain. An aide opens a door to a private office down the corridor. You step inside and find a quiet space, bathed in warm lamplight. A polished oak desk sits beneath a tall window that overlooks green lawns dotted with spring blossoms. You approach the desk and rest both hands on its surface, feeling smooth grain beneath your fingertips. In the silence, you hear your own breathing, measured and even. You close your eyes and reflect on what you have just accomplished and what remains ahead. You recall the speech you delivered only an hour ago. Each phrase hung in the air, weighted by hope and caution. You remember a flash of doubt as you spoke, that moment when you wondered if your words would uplift or deepen divisions. Now you know the crowd heard your vow and watched you leave, yet none can follow you into this calm solitude. You gather the envelopes on the desk, a briefing on economic policy, a schedule of cabinet meetings, a dossier on foreign unrest. Each envelope bears a crisp seal and a date that marks it as urgent. You open the first, scanning bullet points on budget shortfalls and tax reforms. You underline phrases that demand immediate dialogue with your Treasury Secretary. Next, you set the envelope aside and open a slim folder labeled Cabinet Appointments. You pause at each name, recalling each senator or diplomat you must now trust to shape policy with you. You feel responsibility for each appointment, aware that each person carries loyalty to their own views. You close that folder and reach for a final envelope on foreign affairs. You open it and read reports of growing tension in a distant region. You note alliances that tremble from recent announcements. You lean back in a leather chair and rub at your temples. Each name on these pages links to real people, with families and fears of their own. You feel the weight of holding these lives in your hands. The lamp's glow shifts as a gentle breeze flows through the window. You step forward and look outside. Below, on the lawn, small flags flutter in the warm breeze. Each flag represents a state, a community, a story of settlement, of conflict, of perseverance. You stand there, looking out at symbols of unity, even though divisions endure. You recall that your inauguration was meant to promise unity and strength. Now, you must live up to that promise by facing challenges that can easily fracture trust. An aiding hand taps your shoulder. You turn to see your chief of staff standing in the doorway. In her hand is a fresh briefing on immediate security concerns. She says that new intelligence suggests protests will continue late into the afternoon. You glance at your watch. You realize that the day will not pause for reflection. Decisions await in every room you enter. You nod and switch your focus to the new note. She points to a line that details a request from military leaders for a meeting on troop deployments. You realize you must choose between sending armed forces abroad or holding them in reserve for homeland needs. Both options carry risk. You fold the note and slip it into your suit jacket. You understand that each choice will shape the future and that no option brings guaranteed peace. Your child's voice echoes down the hallway. You meet them at the threshold and laugh as they show you a small drawing they made earlier. It is a crude sketch of you standing behind a podium, the sun shining overhead. You ruffle their hair and promise to spend an hour this evening helping them finish a painting. As the child bounces away to play, you feel a flash of warmth at your core. Their innocence reminds you why you accepted this burden. Each choice you make can shape a nation, and also shape the world your child will inherit. An advisor hurries forward and issues a final reminder. You must address the press in 20 minutes to clarify your position on recent policy changes. You nod, standing and brushing off the seat of your suit. You reach into your jacket pocket and retrieve your notes from the morning speech. You glance at key phrases meant to address unity and resilience. You know that the press will scrutinize every shift in tone, every hesitation. You step back to the desk and smooth your notes, knowing that hesitation can appear as weakness, and that weakness can breed uncertainty. You rise and walk toward a narrow door that leads to a hallway lined with offices. You take a moment to steady your breathing. You recall that the day's trials tested your voice, your resolve, and your ability to navigate a sea of expectations. Now you face a corridor where each door hides its own challenges. Behind one sits a cabinet secretary eager to press a personal agenda. Behind another waits a representative of foreign power seeking reassurances. Each room demands a diplomatic tone, a firm stance, and a steady hand. You place your hand on the doorknob and exhale. You step forward, crossing the threshold into a room where aides await to brief you on the next crisis. You feel the familiar tingle of anticipation and responsibility coiling in your chest. You stand at attention as the briefing begins. You listen intently, absorbing every detail. You know that each piece of information, each statistic, each personal account shapes your decisions. During the meeting, you hear opinions clash, strategies proposed and rebutted, requests for resources and warnings of unintended consequences. You resist the urge to shut out discordant voices. Instead, you lean forward, resting your elbows on the polished table. Your gaze sweeps the room, pausing at each face. You see concerns etched in furrowed brows, anxiety flickering in worried eyes. You remind yourself that leadership demands listening as much as it demands direction. When the meeting ends, you step out into the hallway. A sense of exhaustion washes over you. You carry 3 folders pinned to your chest, each stamped urgent. You search your mind for a plan of action. You feel the corridor's length stretch before you, like a path you must walk step by step. You begin with the first folder marked Foreign Affairs. You recall lines from the morning speech on diplomatic unity. You draft a statement in your mind that reaffirms alliance and cautions against rash action. You fold your hands and whisper a vow. We will act with prudence and purpose. You move to the next folder on economic policy. You remember advice from your Treasury Secretary. Focus on relief for struggling families and measures to strengthen jobs. You plan talking points that balance compassion and fiscal prudence. You remind yourself that words like compromise and investment must feature in your response. You feel the weight of promise that each proposal must not only sound good but also deliver real stability. Finally, you face the folder on domestic unrest. You review notes from the Vice President on local protests. You recall speaking earlier of unity, yet you know that unity requires addressing grievances. You decide to visit neighborhoods affected by unrest, meeting community leaders in person. You feel doubt creep in. What if tensions flare? What if good intentions fall short? You take a deep breath and steel yourself. You remind yourself that empathy can calm anger more than force. You set your jaw. In a final moment of quiet, you acknowledge that the path ahead offers no respite. As you open each folder and scan the contents, you know that each word you speak, each move you make, will echo beyond these walls. You steady your resolve and prepare to champion unity in action, aware of the anxieties that accompany the privilege of leadership. You step forward, ready to face each challenge, reminding yourself that today's decisions will guide tomorrow's history. Morning light filters through tall windows, revealing remnants of last night's battle of wills across the cabinet table. Empty parchment folders lie strewn among half-emptied teacups and scattered notes marred by crossing lines. You sit in your chair, leather creased beneath you, pondering the words exchanged as tensions flared in the dead of night. Now each minister files into the room, yawning yet determined to resume the fight for the nation's future. You brace yourself to steer the conversation toward consensus once more. The Secretary of Health steps forward first, holding a stack of charts detailing pandemic response proposals. She presents data on infection rates and hospital capacities. The numbers demand swift action, yet earlier the Treasury Secretary insisted on budget constraints that would leave crucial funding out of reach. You recall how the two clashed overnight, the Health Secretary pleading for resources, the Treasury Secretary countering with warnings of rising deficits. Now both stand at opposite ends of the table, eyes locked in silent defiance. You open the session by thanking each member for returning so promptly. You acknowledge the late hour of their debates and the depth of their commitment. You remind them that compromise is difficult but necessary. The Secretary of Health sets her charts upon the table. She explains where additional staffing and equipment can slow the spread and save lives. You notice the Treasury Secretary's jaw tighten as he swivels in his seat, arms folded. He raises a finger and points out that funding those measures will require cutting other programs or raising taxes. His tone borders on scolding. Suddenly, your national security advisor enters with urgent intelligence. Cyber attacks have targeted national infrastructure overnight. Servers in multiple states suffered breaches. Electricity grids face potential disruption. The cabinet members exchange glances faster than wildfire in dry grass. The Secretary of Defense slams his fist on the table. He demands immediate allocation of funds for cybersecurity enhancements and calls for emergency directives to protect critical systems. The Treasury Secretary sputters, concerned about where the funds will come from. The Secretary of State warns that foreign adversaries may be behind these breaches and urges collaboration with allies to respond swiftly. Arguments erupt again. You raise your palms to quiet the room. You remind each member that threats are not siloed by department. You propose a temporary task force combining expertise from health, treasury, defense, and technology advisors to draft quick measures. You suggest reallocating existing emergency funds until the next budget session. The Secretary of Defense nods, acknowledging that urgent action can follow later detailed planning. The Secretary of Treasury grits his teeth but concedes that crisis demands flexibility. A flicker of relief sweeps the room as momentum shifts toward cooperation. Minutes later, a low rumble interrupts the discussion. The senior aide enters, face drawn with concern. She whispers something into your ear. An article prepared by a major news network has surfaced online. It claims your administration's midnight debates expose deep fissures and high drama, painting leadership as chaotic. You nod, acknowledging that information moves faster than reality. Already the room buzzes with whispers, reporters pouncing on every nuance of last night's exchanges, critics poised to declare you unfit. You sigh and stand, adjusting your jacket. You remind the cabinet that public trust depends on unity and clear communication. You instruct your press secretary to prepare a unified statement that emphasizes collective commitment to action despite disagreements. You stress that debate is a sign of democracy in motion, not dysfunction. The health secretary, catching her breath, nods slowly and agrees to include references to the urgent pandemic measures. The defense secretary and state secretary pledge to highlight the new cyber task force. Even the Treasury Secretary concedes that the statement should address fiscal responsibility when reassessing funds. With a collective nod, you bring the room to a closing stage. You ask each member to outline the first steps for their departments. The Health Secretary promises to send a new emergency appropriation request to Congress by midday. The Defense Secretary will dispatch cyber experts to the new task force immediately. The State Secretary will reach out to allied partners this morning to coordinate a unified response. The Treasury Secretary will identify potential funding, reallocations, and present options within hours. Each pledge indicates a measure of success in channeling rivalry into action. As cabinet members begin to leave, a trusted aide approaches with fresh intel. A confidant within the chamber reported that one of your ministers secretly met with lobbyists overnight to push a personal agenda. The aide shows you a note detailing the meeting and its contents. You recall slight hints of that minister's shifting loyalties amid last night's debates. Betrayal simmers beneath gratitude for cooperation. You close your eyes for a moment, weighing the costs. Confronting that betrayal now could shatter the fragile truce. Still, you sense you cannot ignore it. Unity must be genuine. You instruct the aide to secure documentation and arrange a private meeting with that minister before today's final press conference. In the quiet aftermath, you return to your desk and arrange papers for the afternoon's meetings. You carve out a 45-minute slot for the discreet confrontation. You know that if this betrayal goes unchallenged, whispers will grow like weeds in the garden of policy, choking trust. You piece together data from internal logs and security cameras. Time-stamped entries show your minister meeting with lobbyists until 2 a.m. behind locked doors reserved for classified sessions. You feel both anger and disappointment as you draft a pointed note requesting a candid explanation. Outside the cabinet room, the marble floor gleams with early morning sunshine. Corridor strollers carry digital tablets displaying news of the cyber threat. Staffers approach, seeking briefings. You stop to share a few words of calm, underscoring collective resolve. Their faces reflect relief that leadership moves from conflict toward coordinated action. You sense the mood shift from fear of chaos toward cautious optimism that policy fights, though intense, yield progress. You head to the colonel's office, known for handling internal affairs discreetly. Inside, you find your national security advisor waiting with additional notes. You slide the betrayal documents across his desk. He crouches to read, brow furrowed. He nods gravely, acknowledging that trust is as delicate as spun glass. You discuss steps for a measured confrontation, one that preserves decorum but demands accountability. You decide to confront the minister directly, face to face, using facts rather than allegations. After, you walk to the briefing room for the security team. Lights are dimmed, screens hum with data. Engineers and analysts form a semicircle before a large monitor. The defense secretary enters, accompanied by high-ranking military officers. You gather around the table, ready to tackle the cyber threat head-on. Each expert presents technical details as you listen and jot notes. A director from the National Cyber Agency explains how intruders used spear phishing campaigns to infiltrate power grids. A telecom specialist outlines trace points linking breaches to hostile actors. A sense of urgency pulses through the room, each second without action risks, cascading failures that could destabilize critical services. You ask pointed questions. What immediate protections can be activated? Which networks remain vulnerable? How do we prevent similar attacks on water treatment plants and hospitals? Their responses layer in urgency. Firewalls must be strengthened within hours. Digital forensics teams should scour logs for anomalies. Emergency backups need activation at command centers across multiple states. You authorize the allocation of contingency funds and military assistance to secure these systems. The officers nod, already formulating operations to mobilize resources. At last you stand and face them. Time is brief but decisive, you say. Proceed with all haste. Keep me informed at every step. Their footprints echo as they depart to carry out orders. You return to the corridor and notice midday sunlight brightening the hall. You pause to gather your thoughts, aware that the betrayal confrontation awaits. You inhale slowly, steel forming in your chest. Before addressing betrayal, you must finalize the cyber measures. You hail an aide and instruct her to arrange a secure video link with state governors and IT coordinators to ensure rapid deployment of protective measures. She nods, already tapping a tablet. In the adjacent office, you prepare for the private meeting. You place the betrayal documents on a small table, sliding them into a neat stack. A single chair sits across from your desk. Behind it is a portrait of the first president, reminding you that leadership demands courage and integrity. You sit and wait, fingers tapping lightly on the desk surface. You review the notes in your head, planning each question to ensure clarity. When the minister arrives, you rise and offer a calm greeting. He smiles politely, but you detect a flicker of unease in his eyes. You usher him to the empty chair and sit opposite. You place the folder before him and open it, revealing time-stamped records. Without raising your voice, you ask how he justifies meeting with lobbyists in the secrecy of the night. His face pales, and he staggers through a thin apology. You hold your gaze, reminding him that trust cannot be demanded, only earned. He promises to explain and vows to avoid such behavior in the future. You require that all future meetings be documented and vetted by ethics officers. He nods, defeated. You accept this commitment, but warn that any repeat will lead to immediate dismissal. After he leaves, you release a slow breath. The betrayal is exposed and addressed, leaving little room for shadows to fester. You close the folder and lock it in a secure drawer. You know that the night's conflicts and betrayals will haunt you, but you also know that each test survived strengthens your resolve. A knock sounds at the door. Your press secretary enters, pointing to a clock. In 60 minutes, you will face reporters asking for clarity on last night's cabinet battles. You nod and stand, gathering the papers you need. You feel the weight of roles you bear, both mediator of conflict and guardian of truth. You step toward the door, shoulders squared, leaving behind the memory of midnight fights. As you exit, you remind yourself that in the relentless cycle of cabinet conflicts, integrity and courage must guide every step. Tonight, you have managed to channel discord into action and betrayal into accountability. You walk into the light of midday, prepared for the next storm of questions that will demand the same unwavering resolve. By midday, the cabinet room feels like a pressure cooker. Every surface is strewn with stacks of folders, their corners curling with constant handling. The sunlight, once gentle through the tall windows, now glares harshly against the marble floor. The health secretary sits near the window, swiveling her chair as if preparing to burst. She leans forward to address the group. The infection rate in urban centers has doubled again this week. If we do not secure immediate funding for hospital staffing, we risk overwhelming critical care units within days. The Treasury Secretary rubs his temples, counting each dollar in his mind. He argues, we can reassign funds from the public works budget, but that will delay repairs to roads and bridges. People will blame us for every pothole and broken overpass. He looks at you, seeking permission to choose economy over health. You feel the tension in your chest, but push it aside. The Secretary of Agriculture, bound to his portfolio yet anxious to weigh in, clears his throat. He reminds the group that failing crops and rising fuel costs will aggravate food insecurity. If we siphon too much money toward one sector, rural families will go hungry. The Secretary of Health snaps back. Hunger takes lives too, but infections spread faster than starvation. We cannot sacrifice health for infrastructure. Their dispute feels endless. You press your palms together and rise from your chair. We must find a path that addresses all critical needs, you say, voice firm. I am authorizing a limited reallocation of public works funds to address staffing shortages. At the same time, I will instruct Homeland Security to assess where emergency repairs must occur to maintain supply lines for rural deliveries. A murmur of surprise ripples through the room. The Treasury Secretary exhales and nods. He looks to the Defense Secretary, who relaxes his shoulders and agrees to adjust priorities in logistical support. The Health Secretary exhales a hands-up sigh, accepting that compromise. You feel a flicker of relief as tempers cool. You remain standing at the head of the table, absorbing each face's reaction. A hush falls as each cabinet member contemplates this partial resolution. Suddenly, a door swings open, and your vice president enters, slightly out of breath. He carries an urgent memo about a legislative impasse. The Senate is likely to block the emergency funding bill unless you promise direct oversight. Both party leaders in that chamber seek additional policy concessions beyond what was negotiated here. You glance at the note and feel the burn of frustration. You quietly peel open the pages. Each line reads like a demand to trade support for unrelated legislation. Your chief of staff stands behind you, concern etched across his brow. You take a deep breath. We cannot let legislative horse trading obstruct urgent action, you say, tapping the memo. I will speak with Senate leaders directly this afternoon. Let them know we expect their cooperation. If they refuse, we will call a joint session to override any blockades. The Vice President nods, grateful for resolute action. The Attorney General offers input on legal grounds to compel funding under emergency powers. You ask her to draft a concise legal memo by early evening. As the Vice President departs, a moment of clarity emerges. The cabinet members look at one another, realizing that beyond their individual priorities lies a collective need to restore trust. The Secretary of State moves toward the Health Secretary and quietly offers to leverage diplomatic vaccine procurement channels to alleviate domestic shortages. She cites successful partnerships with allied nations. The Health Secretary lifts her head, eyes bright with gratitude. You sense that small gestures of solidarity can break through months of gridlock. An aide arrives and whispers that the press is gathering outside for midday briefings. She hands you a statement to deliver in 15 minutes. It outlines your decisions on reallocation of funds, legislative actions, and diplomatic collaborations. You read it quickly, noting each bullet point and ensuring it aligns with cabinet consensus. Then you instruct her to keep this statement under strict embargo until you step before the cameras. Leaving the cabinet room, you walk briskly down the corridor. The marbled floor cools your feet as you pass the columns. You hear echoes of conversation from nearby offices staffers, debating economic recovery plans, analysts discussing new health metrics, and security personnel finalizing plans to secure the power grid. Each group moves forward, energized by the compromise reached just moments ago. You pause at a water fountain and take a long drink, cold water sliding down your throat. You swallow past dry nerves. Every compromise feels like a victory, but also a reminder of how easily tension can return. Turning into the press briefing room, you see reporters adjusting microphones, cameramen settling tripods, and lights focusing on the podium. You step up and stand behind the lectern, smoothing the papers in your hands. As the moderator introduces you, you offer a brief nod and a neutral smile. You begin. Good afternoon. I have just concluded a cabinet meeting addressing urgent health, infrastructure, and security concerns. We reached agreement to reallocate public works funding to critical hospital staffing while ensuring necessary repairs to key transportation routes. We secured diplomatic partnerships to expand vaccine availability, and we are moving swiftly to override any legislative blockades threatening immediate relief measures. Every department has pledged cooperation. I ask the Congress to act now on this emergency funding bill and to avoid political posturing during a national crisis. As you speak, you watch cameras pan across the room, capturing each gesture. You answer questions calmly, avoiding heated rhetoric. When asked about intramural fighting, you note that robust debate is a strength, not a weakness, of democracy. You stress unity of purpose and resolve to overcome partisan disputes. Reporters fire follow-up queries on timelines for cybersecurity reinforcements, inquiries about rural aid, and concerns about potential legislation being stalled. You answer each clearly, acknowledging challenges and reaffirming your commitment to quick action. After the briefing, you leave the podium and walk through a side exit. You sense relief from staffers who huddle with advisors, preparing draft guidance for the president. In the hallway, the Secretary of Defense waits to update you on the Cyber Task Force's progress. You step into a small strategy room where the Director of Cybersecurity sits surrounded by analysts monitoring real-time data. They point to a screen showing attempts to breach electrical grids. You ask pointed questions about timelines for patch deployment and collaboration with state authorities. They assure you that initial protections will be in place within 48 hours. You instruct them to draft a public statement by evening to reassure the nation that the threat is contained. Next, you move to an office where the health secretary briefs local health commissioners via video link. She outlines guidelines for reallocating personnel to hotspots and adjusting hospital surge capacity. You listen closely, considering how to publicly endorse her plan to alleviate concerns. You nod slowly as she details a 5-point schedule for phased reopenings and targeted lockdowns. You ask her to review rural outreach programs to ensure no community is left without access to care. She agrees, noting that truckers will transport mobile clinics to remote areas. By late afternoon, you reconvene the cabinet in a smaller conference area to finalize memos for legislative leaders. The Treasury Secretary returns with a revised budget outline that reflects shifts in funding to health, infrastructure, and defense. You scan the spreadsheets, satisfied that the numbers reflect compromise without crippling any department. You instruct him to circulate this outline to Congress, with a cover letter emphasizing national crisis and bipartisan responsibility. The Secretary of State updates you on diplomatic communiques with allies, confirming that vaccine shipments will arrive within the week. The Defense Secretary outlines how cyber experts were dispatched to critical sites and how National Guard units will assist with distribution of medical supplies. As the meeting winds down, you sense exhaustion mixed with cautious optimism. You address the cabinet. Tonight, we will sleep, knowing that we faced our divisions and found common ground. Tomorrow's challenges will be no less daunting, but we begin the day united in purpose. Heads nod around the table. Their faces reflect fatigue, but also relief. Even the senior aide offers a genuine smile as she retrieves final documents for immediate release. You rise and gesture for everyone to leave the table. You walk to a side room where your private aide waits with a fresh glass of water and a battery of notes. You take a moment to write a handwritten thank you card to each cabinet member, acknowledging their contribution to this fragile victory. With pen in hand, you write, "Your willingness to set aside differences tonight saved countless lives and preserved the nation's stability. Thank you." You slip each card into an envelope and instruct your aide to deliver them personally. Alone now, you retreat to your private office suite. You remove your suit jacket, loosen your tie, and sit at a small writing desk. The city skyline glows outside your window as evening settles. You open a folder labeled Personal Reflections and begin to jot down lessons learned. How compromise requires patience, how betrayal demands swift but measured response, and how midnight fights can yield daylight progress. You write until your hand grows tired, knowing that tomorrow you must lead with both humility and strength. Finally, you rise and stand by the window. You gaze at distant lights flickering as night spreads. You recall voices from the cabinet room, each representing divergent yet intersecting visions. You remind yourself that leadership is not about silencing dissent, but about weaving differences into a unified path. You turn away from the window and cross to a small alcove where a single lamp casts a circle of warm light. You kneel and offer a silent vow to govern with both empathy and resolve, to hold confident in the face of conflict, and to remember always that each decision carries real consequences for every citizen. Long after the cabinet's doors close for rest, you remain at the desk, penning reforms to prevent future conflicts from escalating so dangerously. You draft guidelines for cabinet procedures that require pre-briefing on contentious issues to minimize surprise and foster collaboration. You outline a code of conduct for aides to ensure transparency and prevent midnight betrayals. Each line you write spurs further resolve that even the darkest debates must yield solutions in service of the whole. You place your pen down and lean back in your chair. The weight of the day's conflicts settles into your bones, yet you feel a spark of hope. In the crucible of midnight arguments, the cabinet found unity when forced to face stark realities. You know tomorrow more conflict will emerge, but tonight you rest with the knowledge that you steered the storm into calmer waters. You extinguish the lamp and step into the quiet corridor, aware that every revolt of ego can be tamed by steady diplomacy and unwavering purpose. You close the door behind you and retire, ready to face the dawn's new judgments and new decisions. The war drums thunder across distant fields as dawn breaks over the capital. You rise before first light, summoned to the Situation Room by a low voice at your door. The room is dim and silent except for the faint hum of monitors tracking troop movements abroad and the glow of maps lit by lamps. Generals lean over a long table strewn with charts showing supply lines, casualty estimates, and shifting battlefronts. Their uniforms look crisp even in pre-dawn light, faces set with determination and fatigue. Each wears ribbons that speak of past campaigns and medals earned through sacrifice. You stand at the head of the table, notebook and pen ready. You know that your decisions here will shape the fate of soldiers and civilians alike. General Meredith, her voice calm yet urgent, presents the first briefing. She points to a region where enemy forces have massed under cover of darkness. Our troops hold the ridge at dawn, she says, but they face dwindling ammunition. We need additional supplies transported by rail before noon or risk losing that position. You study her chart, showing supply trains delayed by damaged tracks. A line of tiny circles marks each broken rail segment from sabotage raids. The general's gaze meets yours. You see trust in her eyes and the burden she carries for every soldier under her command. Across the table sits General Patel, his expression reflecting concern not only for battlefield tactics but for the men and women he leads. If we reinforce the ridge, he says, we must divert resources from other fronts and risk weakening our defenses elsewhere. Our troops are stretched thin, morale is fragile. They have sacrificed so much already. Every request for reinforcements asks more from exhausted soldiers. He pauses, looking down at a photograph taped within his dossier. It shows a young private cradling a letter from home. A tear glistens in the private's eye. General Patel grips the photo, his knuckles white. You sense his loyalty to the troops and his worry that they may be asked to give more than they can bear. While the generals debate strategy, you think of mothers and fathers back home waiting anxiously for news of their loved ones. Protests and petitions arrive daily, voices crying out for peace, for relief, for understanding of soldiers' sacrifices. You hear the faint sounds of traffic through the thick door. Street vendors sell newspapers with headlines demanding an end to the conflict. Factories run around the clock to produce munitions, while citizens queue for scarce goods. At home, the war reaches into every household, and patients frays like worn cloth. You clear your throat and speak in measured tones. We must maintain the ridge, you say, but we cannot ignore the cost to civilians. I will authorize the rail repairs immediately. Engineers will proceed at first light with military convoy escorts to clear sabotage threats. General Patel, I want you to coordinate with logistics to free up enough supplies for the ridge while repositioning reserves to cover the vacated fronts. Both generals nod, though you read in their eyes that they worry about the strain on their forces. You continue. At the same time, I will dispatch a message to the governor of neighboring states to expedite civilian relief efforts. We need food and fuel rations moving out to families who struggle under these shortages. We cannot allow unrest to grow uncontrolled. General Meredith leans forward. Mr. President, if we can hold the ridge until reinforcements arrive, we may break the enemy line and force them into retreat. But if the rail repairs do not finish on schedule, we risk losing the high ground. We estimate a 2-hour window. You nod. Then we will allocate 2 engineer battalions to work in shifts, with top priority for tracks closest to the ridge. Use military police to secure the rail yards and bridges. She closes her folder and straightens, eyes determined. We will launch at first light. General Patel shifts in his chair. Sir, we must also consider the impact on troop morale if more families on the home front face shortages. Reports show that enlistment rates drop with each notice of ration cuts. If citizens feel the war costs them too dearly, we risk losing public support entirely. He pauses, and you sense the weight of his worry. You recall reading letters from soldiers whose families struggled to provide basic necessities. I understand, you say quietly. We will direct emergency food shipments to the most affected industrial areas. Use surplus from southern states where production remains high. We will compensate factories for lost output by offering tax incentives. The priority is to keep the home front stable while our soldiers fight. He nods slowly, uncertainty lingering in his eyes. Both generals retire to details as aides enter the room. A young captain stands to deliver real-time communications from the front. He hands you a small device humming with static. Sir, satellite readings show enemy artillery repositioning under forest cover, he says. If they shell our ridge first, the troops there will be at grave risk. You glance at the schematic display flickering on a nearby monitor. The enemy's new artillery nests lie within range of soldiers holding the ridge. You weigh options. Send immediate airstrikes to neutralize the threat or risk exposing air command to increased anti-aircraft fire. Authorize air support. You decide. Brigadier Lewis, prepare a strike sortie at once. Target the artillery nests but avoid civilian areas. Use laser guidance to minimize collateral damage. You tap the device to transmit your order. Immediately, a staff officer nods and moves to activate the air command channel. You hear the steady buzz of emerging drone activity somewhere high above the thick canopy. The generals exchange glances and return to strategy planning. You sit back and consider the broader picture, a war that demands bravery and sacrifice from soldiers, and exhaustion and resilience from civilians. You think of the school teacher who lost her husband on the front. She now teaches children by candlelight as factories hum beyond her window. You think of the merchant whose shop empties each day, forced to sell at a loss to support war bonds. Each face at home adds up to a growing tide of weariness. A message arrives from the First Lady. She writes that a convoy delivering warm clothing to winter-bound troops was diverted to supply shelters for displaced families. Hundreds of children sleep in makeshift tents along the railroad embankment. You feel the gravity of that choice: comfort for soldiers versus relief for war refugees. You direct the Secretary of Housing to dispatch additional relief trains carrying emergency blankets and tents for refugees, while sending a separate convoy of cold weather gear to frontline units as soon as possible. You rise from the table and step to a side door. A reporter for a major newspaper waits outside. He bows respectfully, then asks for a quick comment on the airstrikes you just authorized. You step into the hallway and speak softly. Our priority is to protect our troops and civilians alike. The enemy's artillery poses a direct threat to our soldiers who hold critical positions. We will use precision airstrikes to neutralize that threat. At the same time, we continue to deliver aid to families displaced by conflict. You pause, letting your words sink in. You know that each word will be quoted, dissected, and reprinted. You consider adding a line about honoring the sacrifices of both soldiers and citizens. We ask every citizen to remain patient and to stand together. You conclude. In times like these, unity is our greatest weapon. The reporter thanks you and slips away. You return to the Situation Room, met by the gaze of every cabinet member. You share the news of the airstrike authorization. General Meredith recognizes the urgency and orders planning for the sortie. General Patel consults his ledger to ensure supply chains for winter gear remain intact. You feel a fleeting sense of relief that action moves forward on multiple fronts. You then turn to review the latest domestic reports. Data shows that factory strikes in key industrial regions threaten to halt production of war material. Workers demand higher wages, citing the rising cost of living and ration shortages. You anticipate protests that could draw hundreds into the streets. Unrest could spread to other cities if not addressed swiftly. You call in the Secretary of Labor to offer emergency wage increases tied to production quotas and additional ration cards for striking workers. We must act now, you tell him. Offer incentives to keep factories running. If necessary, deploy mediators to negotiate directly with labor leaders. The Secretary of Labor nods, leaving immediately to convene talks with union representatives. You watch him go and feel the swirl of urgency. Wars are not won only with guns and missiles, but with steady supply lines, public support, and morale on both battlefield and home front. You think of each soldier shivering in muddy trenches as winter approaches. You think of each family huddling around meager hearths, listening to the distant boom of artillery. Both sides need reassurance. A bell chimes from a clock on the wall. You note that you have moved through the morning with barely a moment to breathe. You realize you must take a brief pause before the next round of high-level talks. You step into a small adjacent office and pour yourself a cup of strong tea. The bitter aroma steadies your nerves. You glance at the phone on your desk. It rings immediately. You answer. It is the president of a friendly ally calling to discuss joint operations. You strike a tone of gratitude and cooperation, outlining how US forces will coordinate with allied units on the battlefield. You draft a joint communique to show unity and resolve, reaffirming that the coalition stands together. The call ends with promises of shared intelligence and combined planning sessions. You set the phone down and take another sip of tea. You feel the warmth spread through your chest. This moment of calm feels brief and precious. You glance at the map on the wall. Red pins mark front lines where soldiers fight. Blue lines mark supply routes. Yellow triangles indicate refugee camps. Each symbol reminds you that war has many dimensions and that leadership demands balancing competing needs. You let the heat of the tea remind you of purpose and resolve. You return to the cabinet table, where the health secretary now coordinates with local officials to install field hospitals. The Secretary of Agriculture is drafting plans for emergency food distribution to both troops and displaced civilians. The Secretary of Defense briefs on the airstrike sortie, readying over the northern forest. Meanwhile, the Treasurer warns of mounting deficits as war bonds fail to sell as expected. Each minister recounts progress and obstacles from their corner of the struggle. You lean forward and guide the next steps, finalize orders to repair rail lines, deploy ration trains, coordinate wage negotiations, and launch the airstrike mission. You ask for updates every hour. You make clear that soldiers' sacrifices cannot be in vain, nor can citizen sacrifices be forgotten. You remind the cabinet that war demands all of the nation's strength, but that every ounce of strength is drawn from lives at home and lives in uniform. As the meeting progresses, you see lines of tension smooth into determined resolve. Even the most heated disagreements yield to shared focus on what must be done. You sense that each member feels the gravity of their roles, that generals need policy support, soldiers need equipment and shelter, and civilians need hope that their sacrifices contribute to victory. Through each difficult decision, you guide the cabinet toward unity, balancing battlefield demands with home front sacrifices until the day's challenges are mapped and steps agreed upon. By early afternoon, the Situation Room settles into organized activity. Military aides coordinate airstrike updates. Diplomats prepare for negotiations with allies. Economic advisors finalize ration strategies. In every corner, men and women move with purpose. You stand at the head of the table, feeling the weight of leadership. You recall that tomorrow and every day beyond, this balance between generals' demands and civilian needs will be tested again. Yet for now, as soldiers prepare to hold the ridge and citizens line up for rations, you know that each step calls for courage, compassion, and unwavering resolve. You step out of the room and make your way through the corridors, occasionally smiling at staffers who rush past with urgent documents. You feel a moment of pride in how far the nation has come despite constant strain. Yet you know challenges remain relentless. You clutch the edges of your jacket and draw a deep breath before entering the next briefing on veteran affairs, determined to honor every sacrifice on both battlefield and home front. Late that afternoon, you slip from the capital into the waiting limousine, the roar of traffic nearly drowned by the hum of armored wheels. You travel to a military hospital on the outskirts of the city, where injured soldiers lie on rows of cots and ribbons of antiseptic light glow from lamps above. The scent of disinfectant mixes with faint traces of morphine and despair. As you step into the ward, a nurse approaches and hands you a stack of letters bound with a simple ribbon. Each one bears the telltale scrawl of a soldier writing to address home or to record final thoughts before last night's battle. You feel a lump in your throat as you carry the letters to a small table near the head nurse's station. A young private, his sleeve bandaged and stained, shifts on his cot to see you more clearly. He looks up with eyes that hold a mixture of relief and trepidation. You crouch at his bedside and offer a gentle nod. He extends a trembling letter and murmurs a request that you deliver it to his father if he does not return. You take the letter, placing it carefully in your inner jacket pocket. You promise you will honor his request. As you rise, the private's voice carries over the hum of the ward. "Thank you, sir. My family needs to know I gave everything." You place a hand on his shoulder and reply quietly, "We will tell them everything." Walking down the row, you meet men scarred by shrapnel and burned by flame. Some nod in recognition, eyes bright with pain and hope. Others lie silent, staring at ceiling tiles as if searching for memories of a peaceful past. You pause at each bedside, asking the name of the injured soldier and offering a few words of encouragement. With each handshake and gentle squeeze of a hand, you carry the weight of their sacrifices back to the corridors of power. Nurses and doctors watch you move between beds, aware that your presence brings visitors and media attention. Yet you focus on the faces before you, each echoing the cost of war. Leaving the hospital, you pause outside and take a deep breath of cool evening air. The sun dips below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of pink and orange. Behind you, wounded soldiers fade into the dim lights of the ward. You know they will need care for nights to come, just as the war will demand stretches of resolve and sacrifice. A press corps gathers nearby, eager to photograph your visit. You lift your chin and walk forward, offering brief remarks. You speak of gratitude for the soldiers' valor and of a nation's debt to their service. You vow to remember their sacrifices in every decision made in the coming months. Back in the limousine, you instruct your driver to head toward a shelter for displaced families. Over radio chatter, you hear that shortages of warm clothing and firewood have forced some parents and children to gather in makeshift encampments. Fear and frustration ride on each radio transmission. You remember firsthand how the young private and his letter haunted your thoughts. Now you resolve to tend to those on the home front with equal care. The shelter is a repurposed community center with cement floors and tall windows bordered against winter winds. The interior feels frigid despite oil heaters gratefully humming in corners. Families huddle around scattered blankets, children clutching stuffed animals, mothers wrapping sweaters around trembling shoulders. A social worker stands at the entrance, greeting you and guiding you to a makeshift reception table. Each person offers a quick bow. You think of how famine and cold can turn hope into desperation faster than any battlefield defeat. You begin by distributing warm coats from a large crate at the center. Each coat carries the insignia of a factory that donated surplus garments. As you help pull arms through sleeves and fasten buttons, a mother steps forward carrying an infant swaddled in thin cloth. You wrap a soft blanket around the child's tiny frame and listen as the mother explains how her husband, a soldier overseas, is the sole provider. She fears that both hunger and fear will overtake her family as winter deepens. You crouch to meet her gaze and say, "We will do everything in our power to ensure you receive support. You do not face this struggle alone." She nods, tears tracking down her cheeks, as you hand her a hot cup of soup made by volunteers nearby. In a corner, you notice a group of factory workers who laid down tools in protest last week. They chant for higher wages and demand to see you. You approach them carefully, aware that their anger arises from ration shortages and spiraling inflation. A burly man with grease-stained overalls steps forward, voice trembling with both anger and fear. "Sir," he says, "we work 16 hours a day building weapons for your soldiers, but at home, we have nothing to heat our houses or feed our families. How do you expect us to keep building if our children starve?" You hear the hardened edges of his words and reply with measured calm. Your sacrifices are honored. We cannot fight wars abroad if our people go cold and hungry here. I promise to address your concerns with immediate action. You ask a volunteer to bring a small supply of emergency rations to distribute. You speak to the workers of upcoming wage adjustments tied to output and a new ration program for industrial workers. You note that factories with key defense contracts will receive extra fuel supplies to keep machinery running, while home addresses receive priority in coal allocations. The workers exchange glances. Their faces soften with a flicker of relief, tempered by lingering doubt. One man nods and says, "We will trust you this one time, but you must not forget your promise." You acknowledge him. "I will not forget." As daylight slips away, you enter the office of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, waiting to brief you on prospects for returning soldiers. You slide into a high-backed chair and watch as administrators outline programs for medical care, vocational training, and housing assistance. You nod at each new proposal, considering how to balance limited funds against growing lists of veterans in need. Many suffered amputations, trauma, or disfigurement. Some speak of nightmares at night as they struggle to return to civilian life. You feel their anguish and pledge to expand mental health support alongside physical rehabilitation. The Secretary of Veterans Affairs presents a chart showing projected demand for therapies and housing vouchers. "We estimate a 10% increase in applications this month alone," she says. You adjust your glasses and respond, "We will authorize additional funds in the next supplemental budget, and we will partner with private charities to broaden our reach. We cannot leave these heroes without care when they return home." She nods with gratitude, then mentions potential delays in building transitional homes. You instruct the agencies to expedite permits and clear bureaucratic hurdles. Let contractors know that government will remove red tape. Begin construction within 60 days. You command. The secretary scribbles notes and thanks you with a tired smile. Leaving that office, you recall the pressing concerns awaiting you back at the Oval Office. Troop reinforcements, domestic unrest, dwindling approval ratings, and the next round of budget negotiations. Yet the faces you met today stay with you: soldiers recovering from wounds, families huddled against winter cold, factory workers worn to the bone. Each memory strengthens resolve to govern with compassion and steadfastness. You walk through the corridors to your private study, recalling the various pleas that shaped your day. Later, you stand before the fireplace in your study as dusk settles outside. Snow begins to fall lightly, drifting past the windows like gentle whispers. You think of the private's letter, the mother's pleas, the workers' cries for help, and the veteran's struggles. Each thread weaves together a tapestry of sacrifice that demands your balanced attention. You open your desk drawer and retrieve a forged resolution ordering additional resources for both battlefield operations and domestic relief efforts. You begin to sign with firm strokes, aware that each signature represents real change in the lives of countless Americans. Your pen pauses as you envision printing presses rolling out the new legislative proposal. It will require backing in Congress and cooperation from state governors. You sense the need to present the plan as a united front. You decide to convene a special session tomorrow, inviting bipartisan leaders to witness the shared commitment. You jot a quick directive to coordinate logistics, then set the pen down. You close your eyes and inhale the cool air scented faintly with wood smoke. You feel the pressing weight of leadership, but also a spark of hope. In the quiet hush, you reflect on the day's trials. In minutes, you will return to the Situation Room to monitor the rail repairs and the airstrike results. You will confer with party leaders to secure votes for the new resolution. You will need to craft a message to the nation acknowledging sacrifices and promising action. When the snow intensifies outside, you think of families along the border who may lose power if storms grow harsher. You resolve to direct emergency services to prepare for potential disasters, even as you wage war abroad. You rise and walk to the window. Each snowflake falls in silence, settling on streets edged by flickering lamplight. You recall how the Civil War once divided families, and how leadership then needed both strength and empathy. Now you face a modern conflict with drones and digital threats, yet the core challenge remains the same: to balance demands on the battlefield with the needs of civilians enduring hardship at home. You press your hand against the cold glass, feeling its firmness. You know tomorrow morning will bring further briefings on troop morale, fresh protests in city squares, and new petitions arriving on your desk. You steel yourself for the relentless cycle of crisis and response. Yet as you finally step away from the window and the snow's quiet beauty, you remind yourself that leadership endures not through isolation but through deep engagement with every American's lived experience. You extinguish the lamp and leave your study, ready to face the next wave of demands with unwavering commitment to those who fight and to those who wait. Late one evening, a hush settles over the West Wing as staffers slip into shadowed hallways, whispering of rumors that spread like a fever. You learn that a junior aide has taken a secret oath to a faction within the party sworn to derail your agenda. The oath was penned on a scrap of paper, sealed with a wax stamp bearing a symbol known only to a select few. You must unravel the strands that bind this aide to shadowy figures who meet in back rooms lit by candlelight and promise power in exchange for loyalty. The aide's eyes betray guilt and fear as you question motives behind leaked documents and sudden policy shifts. Every word they speak feels measured, yet laced with deceit as they attempt to protect their clandestine oath. You hold the sealed paper and feel the weight of betrayal as the wax stamp shimmers in the lamplight like a mocking spectre. Meanwhile, a scandal erupts in closed quarters where a senator's illicit affair has come to light. The senator's paramour is a junior staffer whose credentials hang on a tattered reputation. Gossip spreads through whispered phone calls and furtive glances in corridors. A single photograph appears on social media showing the senator and the staffer in a compromising embrace behind a curtain. The photograph is grainy yet unmistakable, capable of destroying political careers. You sense the senator's panic as he bursts into the Oval Office begging for discretion. He provides affidavits denying malicious intent and promising to end the affair immediately. Yet you know public trust hinges on transparency. You must weigh the private failings of individuals against the public perception of leadership. You tell yourself that judgment must be tempered with compassion, but you also demand accountability without hesitation. In an ornate anteroom beneath a grand chandelier, a cluster of advisors confers behind closed doors. The air is thick with tension. One whispers about forged letters, alleging that you solicited foreign funds for your campaign. Each line in the letter is fabricated yet written to mimic your own style. The forgeries reference meetings that never took place and emails that were never sent. You ask to see the original documents. They lie in a locked briefcase on a side table. When you open the briefcase, you notice the paper is too new and the ink still wet at the edges. You understand that this forgery was designed to wound your campaign and create doubt. You order an immediate investigation to trace the source. You suspect an opposition faction working with undisclosed benefactors determined to see you unseated at any cost. As the investigation proceeds, you find yourself drawn down corridors where power brokers trade secrets for promises of influence. You learn that a member of the intelligence community met with a lobbyist at a bar near the mall. Their conversation was recorded on a device hidden within an empty wine bottle. The intelligence agent speaks in hushed tones about leaking classified memos that link you to a diplomatic blunder abroad. The lobbyist records every word, seeking to sell the scandal to rival media outlets at top dollar. When you confront the agent, he recites a rehearsed lie about poor memory and long hours on duty. You see the tremor in his hand as he accepts a drink offered by an aide. You remind him that loyalty to state supersedes all else. His defiance falters as he recalls his oath. Memory of secrecy and betrayal hangs between you like a gathering storm. As news of the affair and the forged letters spreads, you face reporters in the James S. Brady press briefing room. Flashbulbs burst as you step to the podium. The lead reporter demands an explanation for allegations that you abandoned protocol to meet your paramour in a government guest residence. You gather your composure and deliver a statement acknowledging the personal failing, but emphasizing your continued commitment to leadership. You admit the relationship was a lapse in judgment and that the staffer involved has been placed on leave. You offer no excuses for deception and promise a full accounting to the ethics committee. The room rumbles with questions about credibility and character. You meet each question with measured calm, though inside your thoughts race between damage control and the next step to shore up support among allies. Behind the scenes, you convene a special council to review evidence concerning the forged letters and leaked intelligence. The council's narrow office is cluttered with files and legal tomes. You stand by as they detail how the letters circulated through underground channels. They trace the paper's watermark to a printing press hidden in a warehouse near the docks. You let that sink in. Someone is willing to risk federal charges to spread these lies. You sift through security footage showing a suspicious delivery van parked outside the warehouse in the dead of night. The license plate is obscured and the driver wore a mask. You sense a conspiracy that reaches far beyond a single aide or senator. You ask the council to prepare a sealed warrant for a dawn raid. At the same time, you must manage the fallout of the senator's affair. His staff inundates White House lines with pleas and threats. You recall your promise of accountability and decide the ethics committee hearing will air the facts publicly. You arrange for a press release outlining the committee's proceedings. You will not shy from revealing the truth even if it damages reputations. You believe leadership demands the courage to face scandal squarely, not hide behind false decorum. A raid proceeds smoothly at dawn. Agents in plain black clothing sweep into the warehouse, seizing photocopiers, computers, forging equipment, and dozens of forged letters waiting for shipment. The suspect presses against a wall, eyes wide as agents cuff him and read his rights. He is a middle-aged man with a past record of political maneuvering. He glares at you when the lawyers inform him that his scheme to manipulate the election has failed. You feel a surge of relief, yet know that conspiracies can always resurface under new guises. You remind yourself to remain vigilant. The senator's ethics hearing begins mid-morning in a stately hearing room. Sunlight streams through high windows as senators and attorneys gather. The senator enters, head bowed, escorted by staffers. You watch from a raised gallery, listening as testimony unfolds. The staffer involved testifies about pressure to remain silent until a photograph emerged. Questions fly from committee members about morality, trust, and public service. The senator's crestfallen expression betrays regret. When he admits his wrongdoing and accepts any disciplinary action, you feel a measure of closure. You draft an executive order to strengthen disclosure rules for all elected officials, ensuring that future scandals will face swift scrutiny. Hours pass in a blur of briefings. Foreign diplomats visit with worried expressions, asking how the recent scandal will affect bilateral relations. You assure them that governance remains steady, despite personal failings. You speak of unwavering commitment to shared values. Each visitor nods politely, though you sense lingering doubt. You know that reputations take years to build and can unravel in a single news cycle. Late that afternoon, you convene advisors in a secure war room. Intelligence analysts present evidence linking the former cabinet official to foreign actors seeking to exploit your scandal. The official's confidential files were transferred through encrypted channels to operatives abroad. You watch graph lines, tracing data flows from secure computers to anonymous drop points. Each revelation deepens the betrayal you face. You instruct your Defense Department to launch a quiet inquiry within the Military Intelligence Service. You remind all that any attempt to undermine national security through subversion must be met with full force of law. As evening falls, you slip into the Oval Office for a final review of the day's tumultuous events. You sit at your desk and gaze at photos of civilian volunteers from across the nation who stepped up to deliver food and aid in the wake of recent unrest. Their quiet bravery contrasts sharply with the clandestine betrayals that dominated headlines. You realize that leadership is measured not only by how you handle scandal, but also by how you uplift those who serve with honesty and compassion. You pick up a pen and make notes for a speech. You plan to honor both those dedicated to public service and those corrupted by secret allegiances. A knock on the door signals the arrival of your chief of staff. She stands with a folder of briefing notes for tomorrow's international summit, where world leaders will surely question your stability. You take the folder and nod. "Thank you," you say quietly. She leaves, closing the door softly behind her. You sit in the hush, broken only by the distant hum of nighttime traffic. You reflect on how scandal, sex, and subversion can erode trust and warp intentions. Yet tonight you stand tasked with the delicate act of restoring faith in institutions meant to serve all citizens. You glance at the battered pages of forged letters, the sealed oath you confiscated, and the reports of conspiracies and clandestine meetings. Each item represents a fracture in the nation's fabric. You remind yourself that your duty is to pursue justice without rancor, to expose truth without vengeance, and to govern with transparency even as shadows gather. You rise from the desk and step to the window. City lights twinkle below like scattered stars. Snow drifts lazily in the late air. This moment of stillness feels fleeting yet precious. You close your eyes and recall the private who entrusted you with his last letter, the loyal soldier injured on the front lines. You vow to carry each sacrifice forward, honoring their service by rejecting the darkness of subversion. You open the desk drawer and place the forged letters into a secure case, locking it with a quiet click. You stand tall and declare to yourself that integrity must prevail. You leave the Oval Office and walk through silent corridors, every step a reminder that leadership endures, not through secrecy but through accountability and courage. You exit into a dimly lit hallway where a lone janitor glides by, pushing an empty cart. For a moment, your eyes meet, and you nod in silent solidarity. You realize that while scandal and subversion may lurk in dark corners, everyday acts of honesty and service shine brightest. You turn and walk toward the elevator, ready to face another day filled with the fragile dance of politics and principle. In the quiet of that final descent, you remind yourself that tomorrow's dawn offers another chance to confront scandal and to renew a vow to serve the public good above all else. You awake before dawn to the first tremors of panic on Wall Street. The ticker tape machine in your private study remains silent, papers piled where numbers once scrolled. Your aides arrive hastily, faces drawn and anxious. They tell you that stocks plummeted overnight, erasing hopes built on credit and speculation. Brokers streamed into the trading floor just before opening bell, only to find their accounts drained in minutes. You dress quickly and step into a waiting motorcade that weaves through streets already humming with tension. Store windows bear handwritten notices, sold out of cash reserves. Teller lines form around blocks, families clutching passbooks as word spreads that banks may close by afternoon. At the White House, staffers gather in the Roosevelt Room under flickering lights. You meet with your Treasury Secretary and economic advisors. Charts lie on the table, bank reserve ratios, margin call totals, commodity prices collapsing. You tap a finger on lines showing millions withdrawn within hours. You feel a knot in your stomach, knowing that every dollar pulled from vaults means farms left to wither, factories grinding to a halt, families destitute. You remind them that this is not a distant crisis, but one that threatens every corner of the nation. Outside, the press gathers, demanding statements while crowds mill on Pennsylvania Avenue. A farmer from Iowa appears on your doorstep, dusty coat threadbare, hat tucked in hand. He pleads for relief, eyes full of worry, explaining how his loan payments suddenly tripled at the bank. His harvest rotted in bins because railroads lack fuel. He tells you that his children watch tractors idle and neighbors already lost fields. Farmers once believed in margins small enough to recover from a failed crop. Now margins vanish under every price collapse, forcing default. You study his face and imagine the dust that clings to homes in his region, the gusts carrying soil from fields that once fed a family. Mid-morning, you assemble a joint session of Congress. Senators and representatives file into a grand chamber, lined with marble columns that once symbolized stability. Now they thrum with whispers of panic. You stand at the podium, clearing your throat. Our nation faces a crisis unlike any before. You begin. Banks are failing, credit has frozen, and citizens fear for their livelihoods. We must act swiftly to restore confidence. The crowd erupts with questions and accusations. Some demand immediate deposit insurance to protect savers. Others push for direct relief to farmers and wage earners. Still others worry that government intervention will only worsen the situation. You listen, determined to forge a plan that balances relief without crushing the spirit of self-reliance. A senator from Tennessee speaks first, face red with emotion. Madam President, our people cannot survive another week of idle factories. Children sleep on empty stomachs and parents wander breadlines. We propose a moratorium on loan payments for all mortgages and agricultural debts. Let families hold on to their homes long enough to rebuild. A representative from New York stands to counter. Emergency spending will sink the treasury. We must pare back debts but not bankrupt the nation. Tax cuts for businesses will ensure that workers return to jobs and that production resumes. The chamber pulses with tension as you navigate proposals and counter-proposals. By afternoon, you retreat to the Oval Office, the west window casting pale light across rosewood desks. You pour a cup of coffee and study a stack of letters from citizens. One letter comes from a mother in Chicago, describing how her husband lost his savings and her children go hungry. Another arrives from a small business owner in Ohio, offering to provide jobs if only credit unlocked. You trace each handwriting loop with a finger, feeling the weight of every plea. You sigh deeply, knowing that tomorrow's decisions will shape history. That evening, you join a televised address. The nation huddles around radios and flickering television sets in modest homes, where curtains dangle from windows and dishes lie unwashed. You speak plainly, avoiding elaborate rhetoric. Tonight, I share the burden of your pain. I know that farmers are alone in their fields, unable to sell crops. I know that families stand in lines at banks, pleading for their life savings. We will establish an emergency fund to guarantee deposits up to a certain amount. We will negotiate with railroad companies to resume grain shipments. We will work with lenders to refinance loans so that houses remain homes. You sense cracks in your own resolve as you see the raw faces watching and listening. You mention no longer hidden truths. Entire communities may have to leave homesteads, migrating to cities in search of work. You speak of hope, while knowing desperation grips the land. After the broadcast, you convene a small council of top advisors in the Roosevelt Room. They discuss details of deposit insurance, negotiating with bankers who fear moral hazard and demand compensation for losses. You press them. We cannot let distrust of government blind us to the need for assurance. If families know their money is safe, we can halt the withdrawals that paralyze banks. They nod, scribbling notes on white paper. You give the final word. Implement deposit insurance within days, funded by a small levy on bank reserves. Late into the night, you summon lenders to the White House. Executives arrive in expensive coats, hesitant and defensive. They argue that government intervention will undermine free markets. You listen and then lay out a simple reality. You cannot profit when people cannot deposit. You cannot lend when your reserves vanish. I offer deposit insurance and low-interest reloans if you agree to maintain lending to small businesses and farmers. Refuse, and the public will lose faith in every bank. A hush falls as they realize your terms are non-negotiable. One banker nods, then another, until a reluctant consensus forms. Meanwhile, farmers defaulting on loans face evictions at county offices. You authorize a temporary ban on farm foreclosures for 6 months. The Department of Agriculture mobilizes agents to survey distressed regions and distribute emergency feed to livestock. You recall the Iowa farmer at your door. You imagine his relief, and the relief of thousands more who fear losing only their lifeline. You realize, however, that this is a temporary reprieve. Permanent recovery requires stable markets and renewed demand. You instruct the Secretary of Commerce to develop public works projects that hire displaced workers from rural areas for infrastructure repair. Across the country, families huddle around gas lamps, reading updates printed in local papers. Headlines scream, banks close doors, panic ensues, and farm foreclosures surge. In downtown Philadelphia, you arrive to address a gathering of factory workers. They line up in long rows, hoping for employment in a new relief job program. You walk through the crowd, shaking hands and sharing words of encouragement. You hear grandparents tell children of days when bread cost pennies, when jobs overflowed factories. You feel conviction tighten in your chest. You cannot let nostalgia cloud reality. You must chart a future that stands on cooperation between government, business, and labor. At midnight, you return to the White House, papers in hand reflecting updates on bank recoveries and relief packages. You stand by the window overlooking a darkened lawn, thinking of dawn bringing fresh challenges. The banks you granted insurance still teeter. Some must consolidate or close to survive. You mull proposals for merging small banks into regional institutions supervised by new regulators. You weigh this against preserving local branches that serve rural communities. Each decision demands a balance you cannot fully predict. You retire to a small private study where an aide places petitions signed by thousands of citizens begging for relief. You locate the letter from the farmer you met earlier. His words echo, "Diesel for my tractors costs more than I earn selling corn. We cannot grow crops if we cannot bury seeds." You draft an executive memo extending low-interest emergency loans for seed and fertilizer. You plan to travel to the Midwest to meet with farm cooperatives next week. You consider how travel in winter might reveal further distress. You note in your planner to visit Kansas, write a personal check for a small church food bank in Nebraska, and convene a roundtable of agricultural leaders. As you set your pen down, you realize you have not eaten since lunch. Hunger gnaws at your stomach, but you know that rest will be brief. You call for a simple meal to be delivered: bread, cheese, and soup. You eat slowly, thinking how close that simple fare is to what many families live on now. You swallow each spoonful in silence, reflecting on the cost of recovery and the debt owed to citizens who supported your leadership. Before sleep, you compose a brief statement to closing remarks scheduled for the morning press. You pledge to work with Congress to pass an Emergency Loans Act that provides relief to farmers and small businesses. You call on private citizens to continue supporting local institutions and to trust in the nation's capacity to rebound. You remind yourself that rhetoric alone cannot rebuild trust. Only tangible actions can restore hope. As your eyelids grow heavy, you think of families who will awake hungry, banks that will open with only half their cash reserves, and farmers who may rise to find fields abandoned by tenants unable to pay rent. You hope your measures will save their farms, preserve their homes, and restore confidence before despair takes hold. You drift towards sleep with a faint sense of determination. In the midst of chaos, You sense unity forging across kitchen tables and boardrooms alike. You know tomorrow will test your resolve again as bank runs ripple into more towns and stock markets reopen to further turmoil. But for now, you close your eyes, bracing for a dawn that demands both courage and compassion. Morning light filters through heavy clouds as you step onto the balcony overlooking the capital. News of a devastating hurricane tearing through the Gulf Coast awaits you in every headline. The radio crackles with reports of levees breaking, homes submerged under rising waters, and families stranded on rooftops crying for help. You know that in moments like this, unity and swift action define a nation's character. You return inside the Oval Office to a stack of crisis reports from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. You sit at your desk, cradling a hot cup of coffee, as you read accounts of flooding that chased residents from their homes into crowded shelters. Authorities estimate tens of thousands displaced and dozens dead. Each statistic represents a life lost or irrevocably changed. You pick up the phone and dial the head of the Army Corps of Engineers. You request immediate deployment of teams to shore up breached levees along the Mississippi River. You remind him that every hour counts and there is no room for delay. He promises that units will move to staging areas within the hour. You then turn to the FEMA director. You order immediate activation of search and rescue teams, distribution points for clean water and food, and medical aid stations for those injured by debris and contaminated water. The FEMA director acknowledges and begins mobilizing personnel. Outside your office, staff members monitor satellite feeds showing the storm's path. You watch as swollen rivers spill into towns, submerging roads and cutting off power. You feel the weight of responsibility press against your chest. You remember visiting floodplains as a child and feeling the raw power of water and wind. Now you must marshal resources on a scale you never imagined as a youth walking muddy banks. By midday, you step onto a short flight to the capital of the affected state. The roads below blur as you fly over swollen waters and scattered debris. You recall drafting interest in addressing climate and infrastructure years ago. Here, amid the aftermath, your words take flesh in cinder and mud. You land at a regional airport transformed into a relief hub. Military helicopters circle overhead, ferrying supplies to remote communities cut off by floodwaters. Volunteers unload pallets of sandbags, bottled water, and canned goods under the glare of floodlights. You enter a makeshift command center housed in a gymnasium. Uniformed officers, state officials, and non-profit leaders converge around folding tables littered with maps. Walls display chalk lines, marking county borders and evacuation zones. You greet local officials, who brief you on the worst-hit areas. They point to a town now 90% underwater. A small hospital remains isolated, its generators running low on fuel. You ask the National Guard commander to airlift emergency fuel to the hospital before nightfall and to dispatch medical teams by boat to evacuate the most vulnerable. A volunteer relief worker approaches, carrying a young child rescued from a rooftop. The child wears a thin blanket and stares wide-eyed. You offer a comforting smile and ask her name. She whispers softly, clutching your hand. You kneel to speak gently into her ear as a nurse examines her for hypothermia and hunger. The moment feels intimate amid chaos. You promise you will do everything to keep her safe. You rise to face the room again, resolve hardening like steel. By afternoon, you convene a press briefing in a temporary tent. Mud clings to boots as security ushers reporters forward. You offer a solemn greeting. Today, our nation stands united in sorrow and resolve. The recent storms have tested our communities and claimed lives. We honor those lost, and we will not leave any survivor behind. You outline immediate measures, expanded shelters, emergency medical care, and expedited federal funds to rebuild levees and repair infrastructure. You pledge long-term support for families who lost homes and businesses destroyed by floods. A reporter asks about the emotional toll on survivors and what the federal government will do to help them recover morale. You pause and reply, "Grief runs deep after such disasters. My administration will fund counseling services, community gatherings, and memorial events so that families and communities can mourn together." Recovery is not just about rebuilding structures, but also about healing hearts. We will stand by every state and every family until hope is restored. That evening, as the sun sets behind dark clouds, you tour a shelter housing hundreds of evacuees. Rows of cots line basketball courts and school hallways. Volunteers distribute blankets and hot meals. You greet families huddled under thin quilts. A grandmother bows her head in gratitude as you hand her a care package. She whispers that her home lies under 10 feet of water. Her eyes fill with tears as you assure her that rebuilding funds will help her return, and that volunteers plan to pump out floodwaters from her land. You touch her shoulder gently, aware that words alone cannot erase loss. You then enter a makeshift chapel, where clergy of multiple faiths lead prayers around a hastily erected pulpit. Candles flicker on folding tables, and hymns float through the room. You stand quietly in a pew filled with survivors, wearing damp clothes and faces lined with fatigue. A pastor invites you to say a few words. You speak of shared sorrow and resilience. In times like these, we see the best of our nation. Strangers share meals, volunteers labor without pause, and communities bind together in love. We will rebuild stronger than before. Together, we will stand taller. You step back as prayers continue, feeling the power of collective faith binding hearts. The next morning, you convene a meeting with state governors in the Situation Room. You discuss resource allocations, federal trucks loaded with generators, road repair crews lobbing sandbags at eroded levees. Governors from several states confirm they face similar devastation from mudslides and wildfires fueled by high winds and drought as well. In one state, entire neighborhoods stand in ash and embers as firefighters battle through the night. You vow to extend federal assistance to all regions affected by natural disasters. You instruct the Department of Interior to fast-track fire suppression funds and send extra smoke jumpers and bulldozers to create fire breaks in tinder-dry forests. As national mourning deepens, you direct the Secretary of Housing to issue emergency orders to suspend evictions for tenants whose homes burned to the ground. You call on Congress to pass a temporary moratorium on mortgage payments in disaster areas, allowing families to focus on recovery without fear of foreclosure. You commit substantial emergency spending for rebuilding roads, bridges, and schools. You remind your advisors that every dollar spent now prevents deeper crises in the weeks to come. Back in the Oval Office, you glance at photographs of fire-ravaged towns and a river overflowing its banks. You remember your own community's struggles after a flood years ago. You recall volunteers from across the region pitching in to help neighbors. You resolve that the nation will respond equally, sweeping aside partisan bickering to fund recovery efforts without delay. You call an evening teleconference with mayors and tribal leaders. You listen as they describe the loss of cultural centers and historic buildings destroyed by flames, church steeples, and raked wooden frames once proud now smoldering in ruins. You promise federal grants for reconstructing cultural heritage sites and places of worship. You ask local leaders to share recovery plans so you can tailor assistance for every community. You note that native lands suffered unique spiritual losses to wildfires, and you commit to enact special provisions for tribal recovery to preserve ancestral medicinal plants and sacred groves. The next day, you return to Washington to address Congress on the need for a comprehensive national disaster relief strategy. You stand at the podium in the House chamber, draped with flags at half-staff in memory of those lost. You speak of shattered schools, communities scattered by floods, families mourning lost loved ones, firefighters risking their lives amid raging infernos. You propose a national resilience fund to invest in infrastructure improvements such as modern levees, improved drainage systems, fire-resistant building techniques, and early warning systems for extreme weather events. You urge members of both parties to pass the bill swiftly, declaring that unity in times of crisis is more important than political victory. After your address, you retreat to the White House Rose Garden for a moment of quiet remembrance. Soldiers stand at attention as a military band plays a slow hymn. You lay a wreath beneath a simple plaque inscribed with names of first responders who died battling fires and rescuing flood victims. You bow your head as a single bugle note echoes across manicured lawns. Tears well in your eyes as images of fallen firefighters and drowned families flow through your mind. In that moment of national mourning, you feel the weight of every loss, every dream extinguished by wind, water, and flame. Later, you tour a coastal town completely overtaken by rising tides. Boardwalks lie in splinters, houses lean precariously on eroded foundations, and families salvage memories from soggy photo albums. You lend a hand to elderly volunteers carrying precious belongings to an elevated relief center. You speak with a fisherman who watched his boat crushed by tidal surges. He tells you that his livelihood is gone. You put an arm around his shoulders and promise an emergency loan to rebuild his vessel once the waters recede. You remind him that the government will stand by him as he navigates recovery ahead. By evening, you return to the White House to draft a letter to every household in the affected regions. You write in plain language, "We grieve alongside you. We mourn those we have lost. We commit every resource at our disposal to help you rebuild your lives and your communities." You are not alone. You sign the letter and prepare for mass mailing in coordination with the Postal Service and local relief organizations. You hope that each family will read your words and find comfort that the nation remembers and will act. Throughout this crisis, you remain mindful that national morale can collapse under loss and fear. You order a series of radio addresses in which you visit survivors on site and highlight stories of courage and generosity. In one broadcast, you describe a group of volunteers from a neighboring state who shipped pallets of food and blankets hours after hearing the news of flooding. In another, you share how high school students obtained protective gear and waded into floodwaters to rescue stranded neighbors. You hope that these accounts will kindle hope and inspire unity across the nation. As cleanup efforts continue, you convene a summit with governors to discuss rebuilding school systems overwhelmed by displaced students. You promise federal grants to set up temporary classrooms and ensure every child returns to learning. You ask state educators to help determine curricular adjustments so children can process trauma and loss. You resolve that education must remain a top priority, even in the face of disaster. Over the following days, you visit fire-charred hillsides, where brown smoke still curls from smoldering roots. You stand among charred remains of homes and trees. You place a hand on the scorched earth, feeling the pain of land once lush. You vow that federal assistance will go to replanting efforts, restoring wildlife habitats, and preventing soil erosion from future rains. Local conservation groups join you as you spread new seeds across barren patches. As floodwaters recede, you inspect the remains of levees and cofferdams. You note where concrete must be fortified and where earthen banks require greater reinforcement. You pledge federal engineering teams to work alongside local crews to rebuild stronger flood barriers. You remind onlookers that lessons from this crisis can turn tragedy into opportunity if infrastructure investments prevent future calamity. Finally, as months pass, recovery begins to take shape. Floodwaters dry, fire scars fade, and rebuilding crews raise new structures. You walk through a reconstructed neighborhood where children return to school and families gather on porches once submerged. You hear laughter in playgrounds where poured concrete replaced debris fields. You feel the echo of hope carried on warm breezes rising from freshly planted fields. In the Oval Office, you watch as a relief worker hands a restored fishing boat to the fisherman whose vessel once lay broken. You feel joy spread through every cell of your body. You know that national mourning persists for those who did not survive and for memories lost, but you also see resilience in faces of survivors. You vow to remember this lesson, that while natural disasters can break the land and claim lives, they reveal the best of humanity when people unite in compassion and purpose. You draft a speech to mark the end of this period of mourning and promise a commission to study how to prevent future disasters. You speak of renewed spirit, of lessons learned, and of faith in collective strength. In each word, you remember the countless sacrifices made and the hope that rises from every community willing to rebuild. You conclude with a call to action. Let us honor those we have lost by ensuring that no one stands alone when floods, fires, or winds return. Let us forge a nation that stands firm even when the earth shakes and the seas surge. You finish writing and lean back, feeling the culmination of sorrow and triumph. Outside the window, a rainbow emerges over the Capitol dome. You watch its arch glow with promise. You close your eyes and whisper a prayer of gratitude for the workers, volunteers, first responders, and families who rebuilt their lives. You remind yourself that leadership demands not just action in crisis, but vision for a stronger, more resilient future. You rise and step toward the door, ready to guide your nation beyond mourning into renewed hope. Night falls, and the quiet of the White House is broken only by the soft click of Secret Service agents pacing the halls. You lie awake in the Lincoln bedroom, every creak of floorboards sounding like a footstep closing in. In the dark, you replay every threat assessment briefing and remember every whispered warning. A new tip arrived an hour ago, suggesting a lone actor plans to strike today's speech. The details remain vague but credible. You sense the weight of each breath you take, knowing that a single moment of vulnerability could shatter lives and send the nation into chaos. Your Secret Service director stands by the bedside, briefing you on every precaution now in place. A ring of advanced scanners encircles the podium, concertina wire lines, rooftops. Every visitor passes through layers of screening, yet you still tremble. You recall the first time you met the director. He explained that his officers trained to recognize every sign of threat in a crowd. Even still, you worry that one disguised assailant might slip through. You hear laughter drifting from a distant room and force yourself to believe it is just a party concluded too late, not a sign of betrayal. Tomorrow, you will stand before thousands, delivering remarks on unity and progress. Already, the Secret Service has vetted each staff member in the front rows. Friends turn into strangers when under their scrutiny. You pass a young aide who nervously fidgets as she presents a draft of remarks. You know that if she failed any test, she would be replaced without warning. You regard her kindly and remind yourself that loyalty matters as much as vigilance. As the hours stretch, the nightmares come. In your dreams, you wander through an empty East Room. Curtains ripple, though no breeze blows. You see a shadow drift across the balcony, and you know that a sniper lies in wait. You reach for a corridor door, only to find it locked. You wake gasping. Cold sweat chills your skin. You check the bedside clock. Still 2 hours until dawn. You reach for a glass of water and slip on a robe before stepping into the hallway. The Secret Service agent on duty greets you in hushed tones. You ask for status. He shows you live feed of every camera near the speech podium and confirms that no suspicious movement occurred in the last hour. You return to bed but cannot sleep. You think of those who risked their lives to protect you. You try to imagine the weight of their devotion and let that faith steady your heart. Yet each passing minute feels like a heartbeat in a countdown to potential danger. At last you drift into uneasy slumber. When morning light filters through curtains, you rise with determination. You know that courage does not come from ignoring fear, but from standing tall despite it. As you step toward your speech, you remind yourself that every leader faces risk. You walk out into the day, prepared to address a nation. trusting that those who watch your back will keep you safe. Every morning you awaken to a fresh wave of barbed editorials attacking your policies and your character. Newspapers, lining city sidewalks, proclaim scathing headlines that seem to evolve overnight. Cartoonists draw you as a hapless buffoon, slipping on policy papers or trapped under the weight of your own speeches. The faces of reporters who once offered polite deference now twist in eager anticipation of your next stumble. They swarm your scheduled appearances, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward to catch any hint of indecision or error. You recall your first press conference, when you believed honest answers would matter more than spin. Now you know that every word lends itself to endless dissection, that each phrase is twisted to fit partisan narratives. When you wander through the halls of the White House, you feel the glare of hidden cameras and the knowledge that each staffer you pass may be a conduit for tomorrow's headline. Headlines announce failures large and small, a misplaced word, an unguarded expression, or a policy outcome that missed its mark. Sometimes you read an article claiming that you are more concerned with spectacle than substance, fueling relentless chatter across luncheon tables and bar stools. Even loyal supporters cringe as they confess on street corners that they hope you will ignore the critics. You learn to steel yourself before stepping onto the briefing room floor, knowing that the microphone may carry a question designed to humiliate you. When a reporter wells up tears to accuse you of lying, you maintain composure, reminding yourself that maintaining dignity under fire is part of the job. Yet at night, after the roar of your defense fades, you feel the sting of every cutting cartoon and every editorial that labels you unfit to lead. You press your hand to your forehead, reminding yourself that surviving this fury requires both resolve and grace. As the country looks to you for guidance, your own world shatters with the sudden loss of a beloved family member. You receive the call just moments before stepping onto the podium for a national address. In that instant, you feel the weight of grief that threatens to buckle your knees. You force yourself to remain composed as you speak words of comfort to a grieving nation, mindful that showing weakness could undermine public confidence. Behind closed doors, tears fall as you clutch familiar objects, reminders of laughter around family dinners and quiet weekend mornings. Yet your schedule remains relentless. Photo sessions, diplomatic meetings, and fundraisers carry on without pause. You learn to compartmentalize sorrow, setting it aside like an unwelcome visitor to fulfill the duties that demand your presence. Each public event becomes a tightrope walk between honoring private grief and fulfilling public obligation. In moments of solitude, you revisit cherished memories, heart heavy with longing, and wonder if the nation truly understands your loss. When reporters ask how you cope with national crises while mourning at home, you offer a measured response about drawing strength from service. Insiders watch as you tuck notes into pockets, ready to redirect tears toward resolve. Even close aides avoid overt condolences, knowing that emotional displays could break the fragile image of leadership. At times, you slip into the residence and briefly collapse into the arms of a grieving spouse, the two of you cradling memories amid family photos. Yet the moment dissolves quickly as phone rings, and the next call demands action on urgent policy. You remind yourself that your grief is shared by countless families who lost loved ones, and that your role demands steady leadership. Each time you turn grief into purpose, you honor both your family's memory and the nation's hope. The Capitol girds itself for yet another session, where progress stalls in a tangled web of partisan interests. You stand at the podium of the Senate chamber, eyeing rows of lawmakers who refuse to yield on critical bills. Some demand sweeping reforms rather than incremental steps. Others insist on unattainable concessions before even allowing a vote. You find yourself shuttling between office suites, negotiating compromises while avoiding ultimatums that would doom fragile coalitions. Hours stretch into days as committee chairs delay hearings, using parliamentary maneuvers to kill proposals you champion. Your staff prepares talking points to counter accusations of overreach, reminding lawmakers that constituents expect action. Frustration mounts as older members lean on tradition to block progress. You wrestle with decisions about whether to issue a veto on bills you deem inadequate or harmful. Each veto carries political cost: angry allies, blistering editorials, and the risk of gridlock that prevents future collaboration. When you veto a bill that would cut essential funding for infrastructure because it lacks accountability measures, your phone rings with complaints from both sides. Some supporters whisper that signing at least patched the roads. Critics warn that you overstepped executive authority. You weigh each veto carefully, understanding that overriding action by Congress may redraw the balance of power. Late one night, you approve a genuine reform package only to learn that key lawmakers have inserted last-minute provisions burying its intent. You sit in silent fury, torn between signing flawed legislation or sending it back with a veto threat that could collapse negotiations. In the end, you choose to veto, sacrificing short-term gains for long-term principles. Each veto battle leaves scars on relationships and tarnishes hope for unity. You close your eyes and recall why you sought this office: to enact meaningful change. Yet every session reminds you that even the simplest law requires a symphony of compromise and courage to overcome entrenched opposition. You arrive at the State Department to find an international incident spiraling out of control. An ally's ambassador stands ready to declare hostilities after a covert operation gone awry. The intelligence community provided inaccurate reports, and special forces struck a location believed to harbor enemies but instead targeted civilian structures. Photographs of the aftermath reach newspapers worldwide, fueling outrage across nations. The United Nations demands an immediate apology. You convene a crisis cell with your national security advisor, the Secretary of State, and top foreign policy aides. Each expert offers contradictory guidance. Some urge forceful denouncement of the ally. Others warn of rupturing critical alliances. You pace the situation room as every television screen broadcasts protests in capital cities. Hostile ambassadors refuse to meet. You pick up the secure line to speak with allied leaders, but the line goes dead. You face the reality that a single mistake by covert operatives can echo across oceans and threaten peace. In private, you weigh the cost of exposing classified methods versus maintaining trust with global partners. You choose to offer a public apology, acknowledging missteps and pledging reparations. The morning press seizes on your statement. We regret the unintended casualties. We will accept responsibility and work to rebuild trust. Critics howl that you weakened national security by revealing covert operations. Some lawmakers demand your resignation. You respond with a calmer tone, asserting that transparency and accountability strengthen alliances more than secrecy. You then dispatch your Secretary of State on an urgent diplomatic mission, instructing him to secure a ceasefire and negotiate refugee assistance. You monitor satellite feeds, showing troop movements along disputed borders. Meanwhile, secret talks begin in a distant embassy basement, where envoys from rival nations weigh whether to seize advantage. You think of every decision as a balance between sovereignty and cooperation. Each misstep carries the power to unleash conflict on a global scale. Imagine stepping into the Oval Office, only to find your every action scrutinized under the glare of history. You rise before dawn to briefings on national security threats, economic instability, and humanitarian crises. Before coffee cools, you issue orders that could save or cost thousands of lives. Each word you speak will be quoted, debated, and dissected by millions. Mid-morning brings a relentless schedule of meetings, one with generals to discuss foreign entanglements, another with the Treasury Secretary to stave off market panic, and yet another with lawmakers gridlocked in partisan bickering. By noon, you face a media throng demanding answers to scandals that erupted overnight. Catcalls and faint applause define the soundtrack of your speech. You feel the weight of every citizen's expectation pressing on your shoulders. Afternoon finds you torn between vetoing a bill that undermines civil rights and risking your popularity. As evening falls, you must address survivors of a devastating hurricane, comforting them while personally grieving the loss of a close family member. Just when you believe you can rest, a whistleblower leaks classified documents, igniting a diplomatic firestorm with trusted allies. You wade through legal briefs, and approving the raid on foreign hackers before sleep claims an hour of your night. The next dawn brings another set of crises screaming for your attention. In such a life, even the simplest decision carries global consequences. You teeter between personal loss and public duty, torn between the burden of grief and the need to guide a nation. Every fleeting moment demands clarity under impossible pressure. You learn that frail humanity and unwavering resolve must coexist to navigate this relentless storm. If you believe you could endure one day, recall that each sunrise opens a new gauntlet of challenges impossible to foresee. In the face of constant scrutiny, razor-sharp decisions, and the burden of public trust, you realize that few people could last even a single day as president.